Mr. President, 2 weeks ago, Secretary Pompeo appeared before the Appropriations Committee, and I got the chance to ask him a simple question. I asked him whether it was still the position of the United States that Russia should not be allowed to join the G7 without adhering to the outlines of the Minsk Agreement. That is the agreement that seeks to try to resolve the crisis that has been created in Europe and in Ukraine by the Russian invasion of eastern Ukraine. And I give Secretary Pompeo credit because his answer was brutally honest. He said that he certainly could foresee a series of trade-offs with the Russians by which they would be allowed to join the G7, rejoin the G7, without withdrawing their forces from eastern Ukraine or Crimea. That is a stunning reversal of prior U.S. policy, the idea that we would trade away Ukraine for some set of concessions from Russia on another area of national security, maybe in the Middle East. But it is unsurprising. It is unsurprising because, as Donald Trump has made clear over and over again, his primary objective is to become friends with Vladimir Putin. His primary objective is to try to square himself and the Kremlin without regard to consequences for U.S. national security. And so I'm very pleased to join Senator Menendez and Senator Schumer and Senator Reid on the floor today to express our hope and desire that President Trump finds some way to stop undermining the NATO alliance as he heads for this important summit, and understands that Russia presents a real and present danger to the world order, to American security, and to the future of global security if we continue to communicate to them that they pay no consequences for their erasure of borders in and around their periphery and their continued attempts to manipulate elections outside of their borders. I hope that there are others in the room with President Trump and Vladimir Putin when they meet, because it is hard for us to understand what leverage Putin has over Trump such that he would continue to give away so much to Russia without getting very much in return, why he would continue to do Russia's bidding in trying to tear apart NATO and trying to tear apart the EU without getting anything in return. I don't know what leverage Putin has over Trump, but I feel much more comfortable if there were some other people in that room who could be witness to those discussions to make sure that that discussion with Putin doesn't go the same way that the discussion with President Kim did in North Korea. I also am here on the floor to remind my colleagues about the importance of this underlying relationship with Europe. I'm sure my colleagues have already said it, but let's just remember that Article 5 has only been exercised one time, and it was in the defense of the United States. It was when the United States was attacked, and we asked our NATO allies to join with us to try to rid Afghanistan of a government that had given shelter to those who had attacked us. Don't forget that NATO exists for our benefit as well as for Europe's benefit. Don't also forget that for 4 consecutive years, European governments have been increasing their defense spending. Countries have been scaling up for 4 consecutive years their contributions to the defense budgets. But I also don't want my colleagues to think that the measure of transatlantic security is simply the amount of money that you're putting into a defense budget. I'm not saying that that isn't important, but this administration from the beginning has had backwards the way in which you protect America from the threats that we face all around the world. Peace does come through military strength, but increasingly the threats that we face, increasingly the threats that Russia presents to the United States and to our allies, are non-kinetic threats, are not military threats, and they require other means of counteraction. So as you're trying to measure whether Europe is a full and meaningful participant in a security arrangement with the United States, I don't mind measuring defense contributions, which are increasing year by year. But let's also remember that it is Europe that is handling the flood of refugees, leaving the security vacuum of the Middle East. The United States is doing nothing of consequence, of importance to handle that refugee flow. It is Europe that is dealing with that refugee flow. It is Europe that often deals with the most mature terrorist organizations setting up cells inside of Europe. It has, in fact, been Europe that has borne the brunt of terrorist attacks since 9/11, due to those mature organizations being able to exist inside Europe. It is the counterterrorism capacity and the law enforcement capacity that Europe offers to confront those threats that also matters to our security. It's Europe that has had to stand up capacities to counter Russian propaganda that floods, in particular, Eastern Europe and the Balkans, but also Central and Western Europe as well. We don't measure those counter-propaganda resources in the defense budget, but they are serious and they are increasing. And it is Europe that has had to have spent billions of dollars trying to diversify their energy supplies so as to cut off Russia's most important revenue source, the export of oil and gas. The United States provides advice to Europe on how to do that, but it is Europe that is spending hard dollars, reverse flowing, diversifying domestic energy, bringing in gas from other countries besides Russia that has made the biggest difference. And so I want my friends here to understand the holistic nature of the security partnership that we enjoy with Europe and with our NATO allies. Yes, defense spending matters, but it is representative of this administration's unwillingness to understand the panoply of ways in which you need to defend our country, besides just a robust defense budget, that causes them to misunderstand the nature of this relationship. It's Europe's focus on refugee resettlement. It's Europe's focus on counter-propaganda capacities. It's Europe's focus on fighting Russian propaganda. It's Europe's focus on diversifying their energy supplies that add, frankly, just as much to our joint security as their defense spending does. Now, I don't expect that Donald Trump, given how little study he affords to the national security of the United States, is going to get up to school on all of these different capacities that Europe lends the alliance. But it's important for us on a bipartisan basis to recognize that this is a strong alliance, that as much as we both push and pull each other, it remains strong. And don't think that the grievances only lie on our side of the aisle. Our European partners for years told us that we were making our collective security weaker by continuing an invasion and occupation of Iraq that was creating more terrorists than it was killing. So we have grievances with our partners in Europe, but they have had historic grievances with us as well. And it's important for us to recognize that historical fact as well. I am here to express my desire that this president acknowledge the importance of this alliance. I am here expressing the hope that the summit isn't the unmitigated disaster that most people think it will be, given the spirit in which the president leaves for it, castigating our NATO allies on his way out the door. And I don't want us to come to the conclusion that without NATO, without the European Union, without the post-World War II structures that we created in the midst of the rubble of that global conflict, that global security can be preserved. We have taken for granted that countries don't march on each other by and large any longer. While we still have instability, we don't have nations invading other nations in the way that we did 100 years ago. That's because of NATO. That's because of the set of global security structures that the United States and Europe have helped stand up together. And if they fall apart, as it seems that this president roots for on a regular basis, then our assumption of how conflict will play out or not play out over the course of the next 10 to 20 to 30 years falls apart as well. And so, Mr. President, I'm glad to join my colleagues today in support of the NATO alliance and in hope that the President understands the importance of it as he heads off to this critical summit. I yield the floor.